You are listening to the Visualising War podcast. In each episode, we talk about representations of war in art, text, film, and music. With new guests each time, we look at how people have described or imagined war in different periods and places, and we discuss the impact which war stories have on us as individuals and societies. Hello, my name is Alice Koenig, and I co-direct the Visualising War project at the University of St Andrews. Joining me on the podcast today are two well-known authors and policy advisors on future warfare, Peter Warren Singer and August Cole. Peter is a strategist at New America, a professor of practice at Arizona State University, and principal at Useful Fiction LLC, a network of creators, thinkers, and artists who explore the potential of fiction and other media to forecast future trends. He has served as a consultant for the US military, intelligence community, and FBI, and he sits on the US military's Transformation Advisory Group and NATO's Innovation Advisory Board, among other roles. In the entertainment sector, he's advised a range of programs, including for Warner Brothers, DreamWorks, Universal, HBO, Discovery, History Channel, and the video game series Call of Duty. He's the author of a number of best-selling books, including Corporate Warriors, The Rise of the Privatized Military Industry, Children at War, Wired for War, Cybersecurity and Cyber War, and Like War, which explores how social media has changed war and politics has changed social media. Like Peter, August is a principal at Useful Fiction, the network which they founded together. And like Peter again, he explores the future of conflict through fiction and other forms of FICINT, fictional intelligence storytelling. His talks, short stories, and workshops have taken him from speaking at the Nobel Institute in Oslo to lecturing at West Point. August is a non-resident fellow at the Brute Krulak Center for Innovation and Creativity at Marine Corps University and a non-resident senior fellow at the Scowcroft Center on Strategy and Security at the Atlantic Council. From 2014 to 17, he directed the Council's Art of Future Warfare project, which explored creative works for insight into future conflict. August is a regular speaker to private sector, academic, and US and allied government audiences. He also leads the strategy team for the Warring with Machines AI ethics project at the Peace Research Institute of Oslo. With Peter, August is the co-author of the bestseller Ghost Fleet, a novel of the next World War, published in 2015, and Burn-In, a novel of the real robotic revolution, published in 2020. We're going to be diving into Ghost Fleet in particular in this podcast, but we'll also be talking more generally about habits and processes of visualizing future warfare and what different media can bring to this. So Peter and August, I'm very grateful to you for taking the time to talk to me today. Welcome to the Visualizing War podcast.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Peter, you've been described in the Wall Street Journal as the premier futurist in the national security environment and named by the Smithsonian, by Defense News, by Foreign Policy as among the top 100 global thinkers and as an official mad scientist for the US Army's Training and Doctrine Command. It has been said of you that no author, living or dead, has more books on the professional US military reading lists. So my first question to you is, where did all of that start? What got you started down the road of visualizing future warfare and forecasting future trends?
Oh my goodness. Well, those are very kind things to lead with. I'm actually going to echo back to how I began a book called Wired for War that looked at the future of robotics, but I think very appropriate to this podcast. It actually began with a look at the past, and it looked at, there's a wonderful book by John Keegan, Six Armies at Normandy, where he began, it's, the story of the armies at Normandy, the D-Day invasion, but he began with a story from his own youth. And so I was inspired by that in that book and did the same thing. And I was a 6-year-old that if you handed me a stick, within probably a minute, that stick would either have been transformed, so to speak, into a lightsaber or a Tommy gun. And I was going to go off and fight Darth Vader or go off and defend the neighborhood against the invading Nazi horde. And so, why was that? And it was, we're all shaped by what's around us. And it was that combination of everything from science fiction to my family history. I used to love going to my grandfather's study, and he had been a Navy captain who served in World War II in Korea. And, I would pull down his books and his history books and read them. And so that was that start when I was 6. And that, experience I've found to sort of influence me, throughout my career. I was interested in these topics, and particularly this cross of history, but also futures and science fiction, and have been lucky enough to turn it into what I now do on the professional side.
It's really fascinating. Some of the work that we're beginning to do is looking at the militarization of childhood, at the forces that shape children's habits of visualizing war and indeed peace, and all those influences, film, family history, and so on, that you mentioned. That imagination, the visualization that you do as a child, then carrying on through your life as you grow up and into your career and becoming the visualization that you now do.
And then you have to add to that the next section to it, which is the first time I went to a real war zone. And, I tell that story in the book of going to, it was in Bosnia, the city of Mostar. And Mostar, basically parts of it look like the pictures of Stalingrad that I'd read about turned into the real. And that's that important caveat, is the images and the stories that we are told or tell ourselves as youth, and how that crosses between seeing the impact on a city, going to a refugee camp. And so, I want to be very careful to make clear that, it's not the, trying to put a rose colored lens or only the stories of heroes. That's the cross between our narratives and the reality of war. And of course, going back through narratives, that harsh, that deadly, that tragic side of war is also told through narrative. But when I tell that story of how I grew up versus then those first experiences, it's that cross we need to be very careful to bring also into our professional careers.
Yeah, absolutely. Bridging that gap between narrative and reality, and really exploring how the two inform each other. August, could we come to you? You're also very highly sought after as a futures thinker in policy making circles. As I said in the intro, you speak regularly to government advisors, military strategists, academic audiences. So what led to you specializing in future warfare?
Like Peter, I've had a longstanding interest in conflict and diplomacy, especially at the human level. When I was, 11, 12 years old, I was, leaving skateboarding sessions to go to Russian class because I, at the time, wanted to be the U.S. ambassador in Moscow. I grew up in the Pacific Northwest, and Seattle was shaped very much by kind of the Cold War awareness of almost the strategic posture of America was very much centered on that region. You had submarine bases and naval bases and army bases. And yet, at the same time, was a voracious reader of military science fiction that was also, I think, reflecting a lot of the Cold War anxieties that in America at the time. You fast forward that, and I began a career in journalism, which I really felt called to. It seemed to me a really good fit for my love of writing and photography. But I got to a point a little over 12 years ago when I was at the Wall Street Journal covering defense, which is actually where I met Pete originally, that I realized I kept wanting to write about what was going to happen. And then that was actually not the best place to do it, despite having reached a place that I thought I would stay forever. And so I took a leap and quit to begin using fiction to explore these bigger biting questions, a lot of the gray areas, ethics, the operational uncertainties that go with technology, particularly in the future of war. In the last 5-6 years, I think we've really seen an appetite for that, a real recognition that what the world poses in terms of challenges at the strategic level, it's far more than what conventional organizations can really handle. And that's allowed, I think, a place for people like me, right, who are kind of outsiders in this sense, to bring these approaches where you're using storytelling in its most fundamental sense to, create a level of like empathy. I find a lot of inspiration from the design world, and the more I've dove into that, in as much as it's about creating understanding and connection with people who exist in worlds other than your own. And that's really, what has been so interesting to me in trying to think through the future of conflict. And I mean that across the whole spectrum, economic, political, social, not just military or kinetic, as it might be called. And the stories that Pete and I work on, I think, reflect that, from our novels, Ghost Fleet and Burn In, to the shorter stories that we work with on behalf of governments or agencies. Because fundamentally, I think, as Pete said, we're trying to reflect a reality that is really difficult to comprehend, let alone as a civilian, but particularly when you're describing events and circumstances, how people might actually live, 10, 20 years from now. And at the same time, a lot of the aspects of life today that are uncomfortable or annoying or wonderful will persist, no matter, whether we have chips in the back of our necks or there's drones, dropping off food at our doorsteps. The reality is that the human experience will, of course, evolve in how we perceive it. But fundamentally, I think we're going to be driven by a lot of the same things. And so fiction for me has been a way to try to tap into that. It's hard, right? This is I think, interesting and challenging aspect of the work, is finding those continuities and teasing them out. Like Peter, I'm a massive history buff and studied history in university, fascinated by World War II European history. And so that always has been imbued and woven into the kind of work we do creatively. that recognition of the knowledge of what has happened before, may have echoes in the future, not necessarily repeat, although sometimes, unfortunately, it feels like it might, has been a real gift in having had that background to think about the future.
So lots of things factoring in there. I'm really fascinated by the story you told about how you came to this, the environmental factors, as you growing up, that sort of Cold War awareness that were already intersecting with science fiction, and then eventually bringing you to a place where fiction becomes this creative, slightly radical medium for wrestling with the kind of futures thinking that conventional methods maybe struggle with. And you mentioned history and you've mentioned continuity. And actually, I think that's one of the things that's really struck me about your work and Peter's work, the level of continuity between past and imagined futures that you weave into your works, as well as the slightly more surprising and the kind of the technological innovations and so on. We'll come on to that, I think, in a second. But Peter, I wonder if you could pick up on a couple of the points that August has begun making about conventional approaches to futures thinking. Could you just outline briefly for our listeners how futures thinking in the defense space tends to work at the moment? Who gets involved? What kinds of tools and techniques are used to visualize and plan for future warfare and broader versions of conflict, perhaps, too?
So there's a variety of different methodologies that have been used and are still used for identifying future trends and wrestling with those future trends. And the people in the podcast, I'm sure, are aware of them. They range from analytic studies to trying to create a set of potential scenarios that are sort of almost always best case, worst case, medium case. It's like the Goldilocks approach. Then there's war games, and they're called that, but that is a phraseology for everything from actual units out in the field getting muddy boots to a group of policy wonks sitting around a table and you're the president of the US, you're the Chinese leader, let's game out what happens in Taiwan. Now, across those, there's, I think, a series of challenges for them. So it's really not the question of how do we do it, it's why do they sometimes fail? And again, there's a whole series of studies around that. A couple of the areas that, are why they fail. One is they sometimes become ungrounded in that they will imagine a what if that is not realistic, not scientifically viable. Frequently, they'll say, well, there's a widget that does X. And you're like, well, hold it. Does that widget exist? Is it in the lab yet? Oh, but the defense contractor said there's going to be a widget like that, and so we call it the problem of vaporware. So when we're doing our work, we have the no vaporware rule, that all the technology has to be something that already exists or is already in the lab prototyped. Another issue in ungrounding is it's set too far in the future. We can see this in everything from defense acquisition programs where they're like, well, yes, we're going to be buying this jet aircraft to the year 2080. Really? You really think you're going to be doing that? I mean, it's, pity the poor RAF pilot who's getting into the aircraft and we're claiming it's new for them. And it was something that was dated back to 1997. Another part of it is the too far in the future in terms of the geopolitics of it. Who is that RAF pilot flying against in the year 2060, 2080? Is it the Islamic Emirate of Batavia? Is it aliens? I mean, it's just, you're so far out, right? And so this is to deal a little bit and mangle a little bit of a quote from Arthur C. Clarke, who was obviously a wonderful scientist and even better science fiction writer, which is that once you move about a generation ahead, you're moving from the realm of science into the realm of magic. And that applies to the technology changes, the world changes. So we try and stay within that generational aspect. Another part of it is when imagining the adversary, we, in these projects, whether they're war games or analysis, they forget certain types of adversaries, fog, friction, basically all the things that Clausewitz identified. Yes, you might have AI, but also, by the way, you're going to have, human error. It might be something that led to algorithmic bias in the AI. It might be that a piece of dirt fell into a system. Oh, by the way, there's also an enemy. The enemy is smart thinking. Another part of that adversary is the human adversary of who you fight against. And too often in war games and exercises, we basically say, you go think like the bad guy, not pulling from the bad guy's own doctrine. So basically, these are all the different methodologies. And there's a final part, the most important challenge of this. Consistently across history, whether we're looking at failures to get the Blitzkrieg right in UK military history, to Pearl Harbor, to 9/11, the problem is not the so-called black swan, that it was unimaginable. Repeatedly, someone did imagine it, someone did warn it. The real problem consistently is an inability to communicate it and persuade effectively. That's consistently the failure. And so that's what we're after in these useful fiction projects, where we're using nonfiction analytic tools. So it's not sci-fi. We can't, make stuff up. We love our techno thrillers, our Tom Clancy's, our 2034s, but we can't wave our hands at, oh, they hacked the system. No. Here's how they hacked the system. And oh, by the way, here's the footnote reference to where that happened in the real world. Or here's where this, it sounds sci-fi. I know this technology exists. Here's the Chinese doctrine that it's pulled from. So you ground it. Secondly, though, you're using the tool of narrative to reach audiences that you wouldn't normally be able to reach with a white paper. I'm an academic, let's be honest, with something published in the Journal of Nobody Reads It Studies, to a 100-page strategy report that's, for the defense minister, as if the defense minister is really going to be spending his or her time reading 100-page reports that, oh, by the way, are usually written in really turgid prose. Or maybe it's that 100-page report that's for Lieutenant so-and-so. Guess what? Lieutenant so-and-so doesn't want to read nor has the time for that. So what we're doing is bringing in nonfiction research and analysis, but combining it with the oldest communication technology of all and the most effective communication technology of all, which is narrative. And so it's that bringing together, the fusion is what we've been after, and everything from Ghost Fleet to the useful fiction projects that we've done for governments that range from Australia, Canada, UK, US. And that's why we think it's been so effective, is that it brings together, we think, the best of both worlds.
Absolutely. And as you say, that tool that's been around for millennia, I'm an ancient historian. One of the first things that has come down to us has been stories of war, narratives that have processed and explored the ethics and shared understanding, bringing that together with these analytical tools. And your novels are so carefully, rigorously footnoted. And as you say, you wrestle with technologies which are either currently in development or which we know are on the verge of being developed. August, it would be really interesting to hear your take on this a bit more, just fleshing out some of the things that Peter has said about the things which useful fiction can do for us in terms of building empathy, communication, persuading, and also broadening the conversation around future warfare. You've obviously been experimenting a lot with useful fiction, not just in the books you've co-authored with Peter, Burn-In and Ghost Fleet, but also short stories. You've directed and edited an anthology of war stories from the future as part of the Atlantic Council's Art of Future Warfare project. And you've developed this network of useful fiction practitioners. So just be interesting to hear your take on this creative imaginational approach and how it complements or contributes to these traditional forms of futures thinking.
The aspect of collaboration is really important. And as you mentioned, whether it's an anthology or even the partnership that Pete and I have, or the people we work with, there is, I think, a really critical focus in all of this work is understanding that any one person's vision of the future is insufficient to be helpful. And of course, I think one of the things that's important to delineate, we're not necessarily trying to predict the future. I think anybody in foresight who offers that level of certainty is likely to be wrong and maybe not to be trusted. But what we are offering is a future, and more importantly, a way to talk about the future that is, I think, rooted in this human aspect, particularly in conflict. When you think about the different approaches that we've been trying, Ghost Fleet was born of an experiment. It would have made far more sense back in late 2013, 2014, for Pete and I to write a nonfiction book. Wall Street Journal reporter. Pete is a PhD from Harvard. That's like the bread and butter of the nonfiction book business. Yet we felt being able to reach a broad enough number of people to do something about the very issues we were most concerned about, which was China's military rise and the fact that there was too much strategic hubris and technological hubris on the part of the US. We simply weren't going to get what we set out to accomplish done. And now that Ghost Fleet has come out and been on professional military reading lists, now that we've been able to work with writers who are at the peak of their craft in and around the science fiction community to draw them into this larger conversation. Now that we've written Burn In and seen how a non-military story, one that's fundamentally a counterterrorism story about the human-machine relationship, how society is ill-prepared for our near-term AI and robotics future, the disruption, the conflict that's coming, to see how that resonates with the military audience, I think speaks to this larger appetite that's growing for these kinds of ideas, really these kinds of characters through which an individual can better understand what's ahead. Because as Pete said, you can look at a wonderful 300 or 400 page, report on AI policy, but to really understand what it's like to live in that world, that to me is something that a novel or even a film can do in many ways far better, because it's going to reach more people. It's going to engage them more deeply, certainly in other parts of their brains, if you look at it from a neuroscience perspective. And I think begin a much different dialogue. And to me, the kind of continuities of conversation, whether it's around just war ethic or law of armed conflict, particularly like just war ethic, like there's, generations after generations of people who will be discussing and debating. I would like to think that like the conversation around future warfare has that same level of richness, but also breadth, right? So that you're getting people to have voice that don't often get included. And this is one of the things we often talk about when we're training and talking to military audiences about how to do this kind of work, which is figure out whose voices aren't being heard. Who are the perspectives that need to be injected into this futures conversation? Because there is a lot of missed opportunity to, even if we're not trying to predict the future, to be far more accurate. And importantly, if we're being prescriptive, trying to avoid the kind of bad situations that often come to mind. I mean, I'm an optimist who stares into the abyss. So I'd like to say that I'm not, wandering around in a dystopian fog. However, I see the world pretty clearly with clear eyes. And I think it's incredibly important that we don't let blind spots develop, willfully. And so a lot of what we're doing is trying to increase the awareness of both methodology, but also the problem itself. And I think that's one of the differences. Really good science fiction has aspects of this, but when we talk about useful fiction, as Pete said, we're really working with a very specific set of objectives. And that's not to say that this is a very, structured, technical kind of approach to writing, but we have principles in terms of how we apply this methodology. As Pete said, technology a generation or so it has the likelihood of being developed. We're really trying to have an effect, and that is that people have a better and clearer sense of what's coming over the horizon.
It might be useful for the audience to hear about how we do this in a specific case, a specific story. And we like to use the case of a project we did with the Australian military as an example of this. So essentially, they had a wonderful report on defense education enterprise reform. Where is it now? Where does it need to head in the future to deal with all the challenges that are coming at us? I can hear everyone in the audience going, ooh, a report on defense education enterprise reform. Where can I go find this? And it's a 21-page report, obviously important when you think about, preparing officers for the future. But the cold hard reality is that, it wasn't getting the readership that it needed, both, within the line military, but also a very particular audience of senior leaders as well. And so unlike the projects of Ghost Fleet or Burn In, where August and I decide the topics, in this case, it was a client, an organization came to us and said, this is our topic. Can you help us with it? And we need to be clear. We're not saying useful fiction is a replacement for the nonfiction. No, it's to help it. And so in this case, they came to us. And so we took that report. We identified within it its 3 key themes, but also within it 37 nonfiction insights within that report. So if you think of useful fiction as like a morning smoothie, this is the kale, the vitamin C, right? This is the stuff that has to be blended into the good taste. So we took those 3 themes, those 37 nonfiction insights, and then transformed them into a short story called Eye for the Storm that follows a officer from the war college experience back and forth to an exciting mission in the field set in the future. It's an embassy evacuation. So we're not saying, yes, there's going to be this specific embassy evacuation. Rather, the scenario, the story that we created is to illustrate those 3 themes, those 37 insights. So when you read the story, you get that information. But like that smoothie, you kind of, didn't realize that you got it while you enjoyed it. And what was really wonderful about that example, and sorry, I should add, we also created a piece of art for it. Again, so instead of stock art, we commissioned an artist and, we worked with them on the key themes, the scenarios. We got an original piece of art out of it. And so the organization got the story and the art. And ultimately, we've been tracking it. Eye for a Storm has been read by over 12,000 readers, all the way up to the chief of the entire Australian Defence Force, as well as 6 current or recently retired U.S. 4-stars, military service chiefs. Those numbers, that rank, that's not your typical reader of a Australian Defence Education Enterprise Reform document, no matter how important that white paper is. But we were able to get them by utilizing this methodology of useful fiction. And, we like to say, if we can do it on that topic, we can do it on any topic, right? And we have. I mean, we've done it on everything from, future of special operations to quantum to AI ethics to cybersecurity. And it's been a lot of fun. But again, it's hard because, we almost are sort of tying ourselves down because, it'd be a lot easier to just make crap up as you go, as opposed to saying, no, what are the themes? No, what's the real world technology here? Or, okay, how would this adversary actually attack in this way, or, whatnot. So hopefully that example and that parallel of a smoothie helps people understand what we're doing.
Yeah, I think the smoothie analogy is fantastic. One thing that I wonder, though, is how much skepticism you've encountered amongst maybe some of the people who are commissioning this, or at least some of the people perhaps who are on the periphery of the commission, perhaps people in the audience, about whether or not the kale gets lost amid the flavor of the banana, or whether the messages are distorted, whether people are going to take away, I suppose, in quotes, the right things from it. It'd just be interesting to hear a little bit about the skepticism, or indeed the open-mindedness to these different media. You've mentioned art as well as fiction, Peter. What levels of skepticism or acceptance have you encountered?
That's a great question. And I think we've seen it in a couple of ways. One is you'll see people describing science fiction and useful fiction as the same thing, right? They'll be like, well, it's not grounded. There's no research. And I'll be like, yeah, that's sci-fi, and I love my sci-fi, but that's not what we're doing. And you say there's no research. Well, sorry, here's the 27 pages of research endnotes. So all you're showing is you didn't do your research. Or, maybe it's like the French farmer who's like, that's not actually champagne, that's sparkling wine. The other, of course, is, as you put, sort of messages might get lost. And yeah, that happens to any writer, speaker, policymaker, whatever. You send it out there and someone will say, you argued for X. Like, we had a really weird one where they're like, yeah, Ghost Fleet argues for technology solutions to all problems. And we're like, dude, did you actually read the book? The technology constantly breaks. People find ways to work around the technology. So, but you can't control what happens when someone takes it, right? And that's just what happens. I think a third issue is in those, obviously you can hear me being a little bit kind of like, they just don't get it, right? Grumpy. There's a third type that's just more understandable, which is, this is new. It's a new methodology. So some people haven't been exposed to it, or, certain parts of the impact of it, they may not know, I really enjoyed that book, but they don't know there were 3 US government investigations launched because of Ghost Fleet to fix things that we'd identified. There were, in turn, multiple programs to make things in the book come true, whether it was the Marine Corps naming a war game after it, to the US Navy and a $3.6 billion ship program called Ghost Fleet. So, some people kind of haven't heard of those aspects, but, again, that's why should they? But I think part of it is just the newness of it when you're thinking about approaches. August, makes this parallel to, it's like any other problem of innovation. You'll have within an organization, you've got naysayers, and naysayers might be because they don't like change of any kind. Naysayers might be because, well, we just haven't done that before. That's not what we do. It doesn't mean they're sort of negative in general. They're just locked in a certain approach. You also have structures of, for example, how we contract things out within our organizations. It's very easy to go buy a widget. It's very easy. We had a funny thing where a multi-star general was like, we need you to help us visualize something coming out of a war game. We can't figure out how to hire you. We could go hire a consultant to work for us for a year, their yearly salary, but we can't figure out how to hire you for a smaller amount than that, right? And it's because there's just structural ways of how we do things. So hopefully that gives you a sense of some of the different elements of, I don't want to say resistance, but just the challenges that you run into.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think novelty is a really important point there. We are stuck in quite entrenched habits of processing, receiving, accepting information, and we associate authority with certain kinds of genre that we don't associate with, let's say, something more fictional, more novelistic, more artistic. And it can take quite a bit to get over those prejudices, I suppose, those biases we have. August, do you want to come in, I think?
One of the other really interesting manifestations of this is when you're working on the world that is going to essentially, nest one of these, stories and its characters. Sometimes you can discover things that are really uncomfortable. For example, the durability of an international alliance like NATO. There's a lot of really important questions to be asked. What will it be like, 20 years from now, for example? And being in a position to describe a world in which something is counterfactual to an assumption today can provoke a lot of internal resistance. Myriad examples of that, and of course, any organization has sensitivities which you need to be able to work around, particularly when you're talking about essentially doing things out in the open domain. However, I think that's one of the benefits, to be honest, to allow those kinds of bigger questions to emerge, to create a narrative around them. And especially if you're trying to avoid that outcome, to have a conversation about how did we get to that point, 2 to 3 decades in the future. And so some of that is just being used to doing that. It's very difficult, however, in a lot of organizations, whether they're government or private sector, that you can take those kinds of larger existential questions that point to an invalidation of a closely held worldview, and then put that on a pedestal. I do think that you can talk about the bad stuff happening in a narrative in a far more easy to digest and distribute way than conventional PowerPoint presentation that gets passed up to somebody's boss who, has a tantrum. So part of our hope too is that we can use this approach to get at some of those really crucial questions that often get ignored because they're so hard to examine.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned earlier that obviously useful fiction, what you're doing is you're playing with scenarios. This is not meant to be exhaustive. It's not meant to be comprehensive. But on the other hand, it is addressing some blind spots that perhaps more conventional forms of futures thinking, the assumption that you might be looking at the issue only from the perspective of 2 or 3 adversaries rather than these multiple perspectives which come into play the minute you populate a world and you have civilians and their families and their friends and people they buy the newspaper from in the street and so on. And as you say, once you start looking deep into the realities of this world, yes, you can really address some of the blind spots that we might have when we're doing our macro level planning and futures thinking. So we've been talking a bit about the general principles of useful fiction. It would be brilliant, actually, I think, to look now at some concrete examples of that. And August, I wonder if we could start by taking a look at one of your short stories so that we can just think a bit more about fiction as this tool of visualization. I'm thinking particularly of the story ANTFARM, which is in the anthology I mentioned of War Stories from the Future. It's a story that follows Captain Aaron Fung, who's piloting a partly autonomous aircraft, which is carrying out strikes over Yemen, coordinated by thousands of civilians on the ground. And that's the ANTFARM, effectively. So I wonder if you can talk our listeners through the plot to begin with and just explain where it's set, when it's set, and who the main players are.
This is a short story that appeared in the Atlantic Council's War Stories from the Future, as you mentioned, and was a story set, a few decades from now in a conflict that is kind of a simmering one with a counterinsurgency aspect. And the pilot who you mentioned, Aaron Fung, is existing in this kind of liminal, almost like comatose state on a very long duration mission, like 7 days at a time, in what's effectively a converted jetliner that kind of just flies in this slow loop and has additive manufacturing capability aboard. And rather than, building a widget, this fab ship version of like what you'd call a gunship today produces small swarming weapons that are suited to a particular target set. But what was important in the story, I think, was to really unpack, how we know what is going to be worth targeting on a battlefield or not is going to be evolving and changing. And thinking about the trends around social media, thinking about crowdsourcing, Captain Fung in this position of needing to fulfill a very urgent air support request to protect some American Marines on the ground. And he's essentially in a position having to countermand this larger consensus opinion from this social media driven open source population, which is effectively scouring all of the feeds from the region. And the normal way to think about that problem is, of course, sprinkle some artificial intelligence on it, and a machine vision analysis system can kind of do that. But because of some structures in that world, that sort of technology wasn't being used. And so in a variation of like China's human search engine censoring operations, this was a version of that. That's what inspired that. And essentially, Aaron Fung countermands the swarm, so to speak, and kills civilians. And in a sense, the crowd turns on him and essentially has the ship destroy itself, which is a very dark, way to resolve a story like that. But I was trying to make the point when we're thinking through the evolution of what conflict is going to look like, that we're going to be in a position today to think we understand because we see technological solutions that have a very logical progression. But there are some other alternatives out there that are really worth exploring. And many of the same issues are going to endure too when you think about the challenge of deciding who is an adversary, who's a target, who's not. I think that's something that a lot of people can connect with, even in a very short story like that. And again, ending in a fairly, unpleasant way is, I think, part of driving home the really kind of awful aspects of not only conflict, but of course, some of these really delicate situations that we may find ourselves in.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's a short story, but it packs one hell of a punch, and not least because so many different people, civilians, are implicated and become warriors, and not the familiar stories that we often read about past wars, current wars, future wars, often position the reader at a distance from the protagonists. And in this story, there's no hiding the fact that you're a civilian and you use all sorts of social media yourselves, and you might yourself be part of this ant farm in a future world. And therefore, the ethics and the complexities of the decision making really impact on you. Sorry, Peter, come in.
So this is August's story. So I'm going to speak from the outside as the analyst on this, on the policy wonk side. The two issues that he particularly draws out on the recent past, present, and likely future of war, we can see one is the impact of open source intelligence, and that's a key theme that story hits, and how you're utilizing a mix of both people on the ground and outside networks of analysts. And, oh, that's fictional that we would use that for strike decisions. Sorry, Battle of Mosul already happened. And the reason being that we said that allowed us being the Allied coalition, to prosecute faster, make more accurate decisions. So that's not futuristic, that you're pulling from a mix of social media accounts on the ground and a wider network of people. And then the second is the idea that that information might be manipulated and turned. We've seen multiple examples of that, for instance, in both Iraq and Afghanistan, where entities that we thought, both organizations and individuals that we thought were our allies, used Allied airstrikes to go after their local rival. So you had incidents where basically we were killing on behalf of that local feud, thinking we were taking out some terrorist or rebel group, but it was really some local feud that had gone back. It might have been something that went back centuries. It might have been someone just didn't like someone else. These are case examples from the reality of war that August basically, pulls a theme and then sprinkles, okay, yeah, what happens now is you put AI, which you all want to put into this. This is why I love working with August, right? This wasn't my story, but I look at that and I go, that's such a cool way of taking the current trends and then saying, okay, now move the timeline forward, adding in this technology and what we know of it.
Absolutely. And you mentioned manipulation. And I think one of the aspects of manipulation in the story is there's a lot of visualization in the story. So we get to look at what Fung can literally see, what he sees on his screens, what he sees by radar, also what the crowdsourcing set of people who are feeding intelligence through can see. and also what they want to see. At times, Fung feeds them selected images to keep them engaged. There's a moment where he says Fung knew right then and there that he'd lost the crowd, maybe for this mission, maybe for the deployment. He force-fed some of Snakebite's Spectracam footage and audio to Cloud9 as the two Marines sprinted away from the Russian crowd. And he's there trying to manipulate the people on the ground who are then supposedly feeding him intelligence. And I think that's a really fascinating aspect of the story, this interest in the visuals and how easily those visuals are manipulated as we ourselves try to visualize what things might be like in future conflict.
It raises a really interesting aspect too about how societies will be connected to conflict that's increasingly, automated or algorithmically driven, like software. And imagining how this could evolve, to something like this, where there is a push and pull or almost a dialogue of sorts using imagery back and forth. It feels less and less far-fetched, to be honest, than when I, first wrote this, a few years ago, in part because you can see how quickly people are accustomed to expressing themselves politically, socially, personally, individually, whatever, through visual media. And it doesn't mean that everyone needs to become a professional, but rather this amateur aspect is what makes it potentially so effective. And so that is a contest of sorts that is going to be carried out, and I think we'll be in a position to see probably come to greater fruition, for better, for worse, in the next decade or so. It really feels like it's something that's quite close to reality, much more so than when I first wrote it.
August, that's awesome. So you wrote that story in 2015, pre-information warfare in 2016 election, pre most of what we've seen play out in Yemen for the last 7 years, pre the discourse on AI and algorithmic bias. And, that's a great example of the utility of fusing real world information and narrative and giving you an eye towards the future. And the fact that, it's still relevant and useful basically 7 years since you wrote it.
I like that phrase, an eye towards the future, but also an eye very much in the present. And this sort of combination of prescience, forecasting, but this research and awareness of technologies that are actually underway and developing, perhaps beyond our mind's eye, perhaps, under the radar, but definitely out there. Peter, I wonder if we could turn to Ghost Fleet now, which is not a short story, it's a full-length novel, so it offers lots of opportunity to flesh out possible future scenarios over a really extended story, and it imagines the next world war. So we see tensions between the US, China and Russia coming to a head when China attacks US space satellites and launches a drone attack on Pearl Harbor, so drones again. And the conflict that ensues is fought on land and sea, air and space and cyberspace. And it involves a multiplicity of protagonists, so veterans as well as serving soldiers. There are wealthy businessmen, there are teen hackers, and it explores technologies that are currently in development and gets us thinking very much about their vulnerabilities as well as their potential. So could you give our listeners a quick overview of the plot and then just talk us through a little bit what you were trying to communicate with it?
Just as you phrased it, it is a story that imagines what a war between great powers would look like and how certain elements of it might be familiar to the discourse of World War II and worries of World War III during the Cold War, but also would be very different given new technology, new domains that we might fight in, space, cyberspace, a difference of the global economy and China's integration in that versus the Soviet Union. And so that's the basis of it. And the book essentially treats the war itself almost like a character. You can think of the parallel of a really wonderful series about World War II, The Winds of War and Remembrance by Herman Wouk, or if you're a Tom Clancy fan, Red Storm Rising, where we see the war play out through the experience of multiple different characters in multiple different locations. Some of whom cross paths, some of whom never cross paths, but a small act by one might influence another. And that's both because those are the books that we loved reading. Game of Thrones is a similar kind of approach. We loved reading those kind of books, but also it allows you to go back to the real world lesson. The book was trying to visualize great power conflict, how it'd be different, something that, military folks are now familiar with called multi-domain. And as referenced earlier, where it's a novel, but oh, by the way, it's a novel that comes with 27 pages of research and notes. So every time a specific technology in it is mentioned, whether it's a Chinese space station to a certain kind of jet fighter, or every time there's a kind of cyber attack, to even certain quotes that the characters say, there is a reference to it. As an example of that, it might be a Chinese statement on doctrine. To one of the greatest moments that I just love in this is there's a moment in the book where an officer is given a command that sounds outrageous, absurd. No admiral would ever issue that kind of command. And it's actually a word for word quote from what Nimitz ordered right before the Battle of Midway. This is actually something that might be said. And so that's what Ghost Fleet is. It's this cross between hopefully a story that'll grab you, as Admiral said, and it'll keep you up at night, either because you want to keep reading, or oh my gosh, could this actually happen? Oh, I looked at the footnote. Actually, that's real. What are we going to do about that? And so that's Ghost Fleet. The popularity of Ghost Fleet and the policy impact of it comes from choosing to share that, not through a 300-page white paper, but through a fun novel.
Yeah, a fun novel that all sorts of different people are reading and then talking about it generates conversation in all sorts of different areas, which within the military more generally might start working its way up the chain of command and spreading that conversation. And I suppose it comes back to a point that August has also made, this looking at the uncomfortable, looking beyond the blind spots. You mentioned a couple of times World War II history, and I just want to dig into that a bit more, Peter. You clearly like your echoes of history in these novels and stories that visualize the future. I just wonder if you can say a bit more about how you think those echoes of history, those allusions to past quotations or past events, actually help us wrestle with our imagination and our visualizations of future conflict.
So I think there's three ways that it's valuable. One is just the patterns that we see in history. The quote, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. So there are continuing patterns because we're people. Doesn't mean that you see exact repeats, but I do believe in the value of that rhyme. The second value of it is a way of reaching audiences who have a hard time dealing with accepting change. It helps to ground them in the familiar. And again, what we're talking about our work, sometimes it's, trying to help people wrestle with the future. Other times it's just trying to explain something in a manner that is more powerful, more likely to be listened to. We've done a couple of projects where, the goal was to explain how a technology works. Quantum, one of the most important new technologies. Also just really hard to wrap your head around. I mean, it's just entire new levels of physics. Or you think about small drone threats. Again, something that's not futuristic, already here. And so in those examples, a project for NATO, a different project for the Australian military, we had a kind of present, near future set story, but they were echoes of an incident. One was a World War II incident. So the reader is kind of like, this part seems new and strange, but this part my brain can connect to. I get this part. It's almost kind of like holding their hand or you're the guide in a strange land. The third is, it actually goes back to something that you asked about earlier, the resistance part. Many times we're outside an organization, or the people that are pushing this new vision or new methodology or this innovation are, facing kind of a battle within organizations. And the naysayers say, that can't happen. And you're like, well, actually, not only can it happen, it already happened. And here is the example of it. And you can even enlist that in the power of it, where, I was recently doing a talk for senior British leaders about wrestling with all the new technology changes. And, I was talking about AI and quantum, but I wove into it all the lessons of the 1920s and 30s. In that, it's not only, kind of like here are parallels, but it's also about here are mistakes that were made back then. We can choose either to repeat them or be different. There's another part. Here's the things that they did right back then. Here are the heroes of the past. You can be like those heroes, and let's use that for inspiration. Hopefully those are some of the values of looking at those, again, rhymes rather than repeats of history. And one last thing I would say is, yes, I love my World War II history. We're blending in everything from whether it's World War One back to ancient Rome. And that's because, of course, you want to pull in from different timelines, as well as you also don't just have a purely Western approach. So it might be something you can pull from different continents and different cultures too.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when we interviewed Dr. Emily Spears a while ago on the podcast, who's an expert in futures literacy, she also talked about the past as this repository of futures not taken, and talked a little bit about projects which are really looking at these are the decisions that were taken, but what were the alternatives and what might they have led to? And there's something really fascinating about that and tracking through as an exercise in imagination and visualization as well. August, can we come to you just to hear a tiny bit more about the storytelling side for Ghost Fleet and how you blended the research and the characterization, the plot, the mechanics of the storytelling? Peter earlier sketched an account of how you for a short story you worked on, you had a brief, you had data, you had these key learning points, and you built the story around that. Is that very much how Ghost Fleet happened, or did the story come more in the issues and then you went chasing down the research?
Ghost Fleet's development was hybridization in many ways of that. I think both our desire to write an entertaining story and to educate. Fundamentally, though, I think we needed to write a really compelling novel. I think with any of these kind of projects, one of the mandates that I always try to make sure people understand is you have to get your reader to the end. And that's an even bigger challenge when you're looking at a 400-page novel like Ghost Fleet. I think if I remember correctly, our first manuscript was like 6 or something, 100 pages. We had quite a bit more that we wanted to shoehorn in there. But certainly because this was a story that reflects, hopefully a realistic way, all the myriad ways in which a global conflict might play out, we needed to have characters to see those points of view from their perspectives. So as you mentioned, a Silicon Valley billionaire or a space entrepreneur, hackers from Anonymous, American veterans who've become insurgents in occupied Hawaii, not to spoil too much there. So our characters, once we kind of had the larger settings and kind of arc to the story, began to flesh out through research. There is, of course, all the stuff you can Google or look up on the internet. That's really not going to get you very far, I think. And writing for an audience like ours, especially in the core kind of military and defense community, which is focused and rightfully on getting detail right and correct. If you screw up something that is a technical matter, or more importantly, a cultural one, you may lose your reader. So one of the ways we do our research is almost anthropological. We try to interview people as much as we can, and that goes back to my old journalistic background. I love talking to people about all this stuff, so it comes very naturally to me and to Pete as well. When you think about how do you create a coherent story with essentially 7, if not 8 different plot lines, that's a big challenge. And I think as our first novel, there's some of the lessons learned that we had about how to manage, how to wrangle that. One of the tricks I think, Pete, that is worth probably mentioning is we essentially unpacked the story towards the end after we'd really written a first draft and made sure that each character's storyline, as if it were like a novella, would be consistent with an arc and have a nice payoff. And that was a really good innovation that was Pete's idea to try, because it's, I think, saved us from creating dead ends and kind of losing the plot quite literally in a story that had to move in a very propulsive way. Action is very much a part of Ghost Fleet and by design, because in part that's what we wanted to read, but also to show the kinetic aspects of conflict and show it in a realistic and really kind of unpleasant way in many cases. This is not a heroic book in the sense of where a lot of thrillers, I think, would probably do that. We try to kind of be quite clear-eyed about costs, both at the personal and kind of, national level. And, the influences, as I'd mentioned, I read a lot of science fiction growing up. I'm a huge fan of William Gibson, the cyberpunk kind of progenitor, but also somebody who really understands story and pacing and people and how to write about technology, because it'd be too easy to, write a novel that read in many ways like a narrative version of an old Cold War era Jane's, fighting ships of the world book. And that certainly was not, what we were trying to do. And so figuring out the right balance between creating enough technical detail that didn't swamp or overwhelm human aspects. And, there's certainly trade-offs. And this is a big difference between Burn-In and Ghost Fleet. In a story is complex and technically occasionally confusing, I think, for people who are new to this, you are in a position where you don't get as much depth with each character simply because there's more of them. Whereas in Burn-In, we really focus on, Special Agent Laura Keegan and her relationship with her robot partner, but also her family and her bosses, at the FBI. And so to me, was a real nice kind of shift to make as a writer to take on that challenge. And it was certainly something we were cognizant of. But also, I think one of the things that you have to weigh when you're creating any of these worlds is, well, how do you give enough attention and time to the technical while never losing sight of the human aspects and kind of the real direction of a story?
Yeah, and it's creating multiple worlds in one novel is a challenge. But I think one of the ways in which you really succeed in Ghost Fleet is there's a substantial amount of dialogue. And one of the things that that means is that the reading experience is quite an immersive one. It's not bird's eye. We're not looking down at a distance. We are more immersed. And so that world building involves the reader very much. You mentioned audiences there and started to outline who maybe your kind of dominant audience is, August. Peter, I wonder if you could flesh that out a bit more and also talk a bit more about what you hope your audiences do take away from this novel. I know you've talked in the past a lot about this is fiction, not prediction, but it is prompting futures thinking. It might also amount to prevention, visualizing futures that we can possibly avert or avoid. So who are you writing for principally, and what are you hoping they will take away from a book like Ghost Fleet or indeed Burn-In or your other work?
It's a great question. And it's interesting because just last week, August and I ran a executive education session for a group of U.S. Air Force officers on useful fiction. It was the Air Force Futures team that asked us to work with them on, don't write it for us. Teach us how you wrestle with foresight, but not just foresight. How do you communicate more effectively in both your scenarios, but also in your nonfiction, in your memos and memorandums? And we brought together, it's not just us teaching them, so to speak. We brought together a group that ranged from, former heads of U.S. military service to top billionaire investors, tech forecasters, to some of the top storytellers in the world, people behind best-selling books, award-winning TV shows like, Game of Thrones, The Walking Dead, sci-fi authors. And essentially they shared these insights of how do you wrestle with the future, but the power of narrative. And to your question, one of the key insights is you need to know what your target audience is as you're building it. And that helps shape how you communicate. In some situations, your target audience might be fellow acquisition professionals. That shapes everything from the assumptions of what your audience already knows, the acronyms you might use, what interests them, what excites them, what they worry. So it's not just, what do they know? It's what are their emotional triggers, so to speak? How can I build a compelling story that resonates for acquisition professionals? Oh, by the way, where can I reach acquisition professionals? What journals do they read and the like? That's different if you say, my goal is the general public. Okay, the general public, there's different assumptions of what they know. It doesn't mean I can't use acronyms, but I got to intro them the first time I use them. The emotions that I draw in, where I'm writing, where I'm publishing. And this is a lesson that carries across your professional military writing to your wide audience. So that's what we were teaching them. For August and I personally, we go through that on every project. We've, in certain situations, worked with organizations where the readership might just be special operations troops. Okay, there are certain scenarios, there are certain emotions, there are certain terminology, we stay within that. For our books, for a variety of reasons, we hope to reach multiple audiences. Whether it's with Burn-In or with Ghost Fleet, we've heard from Sea Lords and heads of your Air Force to CEOs, to youth that range from young officers to 12-year-olds who were just like August and I, loving reading fiction growing up. We've heard across different, nationalities. The book's been translated into, everything from French to Mongolian. That's awesome. And so we love that. For those books, we go for that wider audience. But back to something that August said that was so important, whether it's that CEO or that 12-year-old that's, never going to set foot inside a U.S. Navy littoral combat ship, but also the sailor who actually is on board the littoral combat ship. We want both of them to go, that's realistic. And how you achieve that is you remember that from both the front end to the back end of the process. From, as August was laying out, when you're building the story, you're gathering the research, and the research might be on the, nonfiction wonkery. The research might be interviews with people. How do they actually speak? You might even be reaching out to get help from them. In Ghost Fleet, there was a scene that was a dogfight between 5th generation fighter jets. That's never happened in history. So we can't pull from that. But what we could do is ask for help from F-15 and F-18 pilots on what moves would you pull? What moves might be pulled on you so that it reads real to them, but also, again, that 12-year-old's like, wow, that sounds real. Well, guess what? If, persuades the F-15 pilot, because it's coming from them, it might be on the beginning of the process. We also do it on the end of the process. We share it again. And this is a lesson going back to talking with those military writers that we were guiding on useful fiction is, who do you share your work with? You share your work with a mix of trusted reviewers and target audience proxies. This is before you send it off to be published or the editor. And the trusted reviewers, it's funny, they almost always include spouses, both August and I, but also this group of U.S. Air Force officers who asked me, who did you share this narrative with? Every one of them said that because the spouse will, say that I like this or I hated this, but it's proxies as well. And when I say it's also other trusted writers, but the proxy are the target audiences, and they will give you feedback on everything from the macro. I didn't understand this, or it might be the micro. This character here said this. That's not what someone would say in that situation. If you're trying to influence generals, then try and find a current or ex-general to read it before you push it out there. So hopefully that gives you a sense of, what we teach, but also how we try and implement in our own work.
So very rigorous processes, partly aimed at achieving the sense of authenticity. I'm intrigued, by the way, to know whether Ghost Fleet was translated into Chinese and whether there have been responses from China.
Yes. So it has been both officially translated into Chinese through a Taiwanese or Hong Kong publisher. But before that, it was definitively translated into Chinese. And we know this for two reasons. One, People's Liberation Army Daily, it was the official journal of the Chinese military, ran a pretty lengthy review essay on it. I think it was like 7 pages long, was the Chinese original. They posted like a 2-page English version, but we got the original in Chinese. And what was so wonderful about it is the writer of it, it was a Chinese PLA colonel, clearly enjoyed it and spent about 5 pages saying how much this was realistic, And then at the very end, he sort of caught himself and realized what he needed to do. And then, said, aha, this is evidence of how they're planning and plotting to war against China. Clearly, this was paid and created by the US military, which, our publisher got really peevy about that because they were like, where was all this military funding, guys? The other evidence that we know, besides the official PLA reviews of it, was during the book tour, August and I had, we'll just say, agents that had really, really poor tradecraft show up at some of our book events and ask pretty obvious and lame questions that made it kind of amusing. So, yeah.
I think it's a really interesting question when you look at how these kinds of stories are perceived by people, so to speak, on the other side of the table. And I think it's a really critical thing to always be mindful of when you're working on them. And it's not always possible to get reader to scrub your work, like PLA officer, of course. However, Pete's points about really spending time to find the kind of people who you think you're trying to reach and get to know them, and if they're willing to give you their time to take a look at your work, all the better, because especially when you get into some of the more technical areas around cyber technologies or artificial intelligence, there are ways that people who are expert in those fields look at them quite differently than me, a history major. And so being able to understand that is really, really helpful to creating credibility, so that when you really push the envelope in terms of imagination or, strangeness in a story, to put it simply, that they're still along there with you.
And so, as you've both outlined, some of the stories that you've written have been specifically commissioned. So, August, I know, for example, you wrote a story called Arctic Night for the Norwegian Army. I think you wrote a story, Rust and Reason, that was used as a discussion prompt for the Defense Department's AI ethics task force. And other stories have been used as part of briefings to NATO's Allied Rapid Reaction Corps and so on. So some of the stories that you've written are specifically commissioned or for very specific target audiences. I'd be interested to know, just sort of looking forward now, what you might be focusing on in future stories, if you're able to tell us that. It might be that you've got some commissions you can't talk about, but it'd just be interesting to know what areas you and Peter are scoping out as subjects for future useful fiction.
I think one of the areas that is of increasing interest, I think Pete referenced, quantum technology, because you're dealing with something that literally is in the realm of science fiction, but yet has its first seeds being planted, so to speak, in the realm of possibility today. That certainly, I think, is significant. One of the areas through some work with NATO that we've done past work on, but is really thinking about what warfare and conflict will be like in the 2040s. And I think if I could, draw out one trend line from the recent work that we've done, is that there is a great deal of interest in what sometimes feels like a really far way out in the future, but in fact, maybe be a lot closer. So that kind of 2040 area, I think 3 years ago, there was a lot less interest in that. Currently, I think that's probably one of our biggest focus areas. And what's exciting about that is you can start to bring into elements such as, near space exploration. You can begin to, as I said, look at quantum technologies, but also it's really important to not lose sight of these kind of social trends around employment. Again, this is a bit the burn-in thesis, but like, what is the future of work going to look like? And what is a society that, of course, sends people to war going to be like in that era? So I think that's one of the interesting observations we've had, is how comfortable people are looking out that far. And that's, I think, a fairly recent phenomenon.
Mm-hmm. So that human element again, and that's something that fiction generally just does so well, that ability to get us thinking about human experiences, human decision making, and so on. But yes, the technology. A couple of weeks ago on the podcast, we had a wonderful artist called Catherine Brimblecombe Fox, who does what she calls imaginational metavalence with her painting. So she looks at things like the electromagnetic spectrum and its use in civilian and military technologies now, things that we can't see with the naked eye, just to draw our attention to it and to get us looking not actually so much at the future, but at threats that are right under our nose. And Peter, that's something that I think has been a thread throughout your work as well. You're looking into the future, but an awful lot of the trends that you've been talking about, the weaponization of social media, the privatization of the military industry, cyber warfare, are trends that are actually underway that we're just simply not quite getting our heads around. Is that right?
Absolutely. And again, if we use that historic parallel, it's the equivalent of the Spanish Civil War and the technologies of the aerial bombing, tanks, the radio, and how that would come together into the blitzkrieg. And you can see that in conflicts out there today, whether it, as August referenced, it's Yemen or Syria or Ukraine, or the war between Azerbaijan and Armenia. We see these examples, of everything from Ukraine. This is referring to past episodes when you and I are speaking. There's concerns about expanded Ukrainian conflict, but even looking back, we've seen on the cyber side the shift from using it merely to steal information to, I think, two key trends. One that's obviously become self-evident, which is the weaponization of social media. And that's something when we started the Like War project, the Like War book, people are like, why does social media matter? And we're like, well, here's how it's being used in war zones like Ukraine. And we've seen it move in digital action to cause physical damage. And, we saw targeting the Ukrainian power grid in the past, and we are now seeing that take place at a larger level, and we'll see more of it. And that was a particular area that we wanted to show off in the Burn-In book. In Burn-In, where the Internet of Things will be in the coming years, but also what are the threats and vulnerabilities that come from having a world that's more wired in terms of, not just power grids, but thermostat in our home to your smart car to, you name it. And so that's one area. To go back to that war would be the cross between the human and robotic. The war in Azerbaijan versus Armenia, through a pretty skillful use of bringing together electronic warfare, cyber, kinetic, but unmanned, the Azeris, and they're supported by Turkish advisors and the like. Basically, in a matter of weeks, they took out 46% of all the Armenian armored vehicles and 93% of their artillery and missile systems. That's a big deal. That's one of those marker moments in war, whether it's the equivalent, kind of the 91 Gulf War, or you go back to the Blitzkrieg. And again, you can say, well, these are all the mistakes that the Armenians made, much like these are all the mistakes that the Iraqis made or that the French made. But the point is, that's something that's a marker moment that matters for the future of war, that's already right there in our face. So hopefully those give you some kind of examples of things that are happening today that point to the future.
William Gibson has said that the future is here, it's just not evenly distributed.
He was, referring to kind of sci-fi tech, but you could say the same thing about the future of war. Much like if you were, sitting in Spain in the 1930s, you were getting those moments. And going back to what we talked about before, the key is not just identifying those trends, but how do I help audiences understand them and act upon them? Means it's both an analytic, but that second, it's that communication task.
I love that quotation, because I think one of the things that your useful fiction is doing is distributing that future much more energetically throughout the present. And you rightly remind us there, Peter, of the impact that can have. That communication then empowers people to act and to take decisions in the present that then might actually pave ways for a different kind of future, or a more secure kind of future, a future that avoids certain problems or at least certain ripples from the past.
I would say that's another key difference to science fiction that we were talking about before, of what things are labeled and mislabeled is the best kind of useful fiction sometimes doesn't come true, right? It's not predictive. It's preventative. That's an actual goal sometimes of it, which is very different than, a sci-fi that's not trying to engage in that process. There's a little bit of a parallel, and we talk about that of intelligence, right? The best kind of intelligence analysis is not what predicts the future. It helps keep the Pearl Harbor from happening, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a really fantastic way of looking at it, and a fantastic way, again, of just looking at the blurred lines and the crossover between useful fiction and other kinds of strategy making. August, I wonder if we can end with a final question to you. We've touched on so many fascinating aspects of the individual stories that you and Peter have written, and the tool that useful fiction is in general. We've touched a tiny bit on how it might blur out into other media as well, and be used in, how visualizing future war might be done in art and other. I know that your network involves filmmakers and other people too. But what I'm really interested in asking right now connects to the episode that's coming up next week. Next week's our 50th episode, and we're going to be looking into the future in that episode in a slightly different way, by inviting a trio of young people onto the podcast to talk about how they visualize conflict and its aftermath, conflict resolution and future warfare. So I just want to ask you a little bit about the involvement of children and young people in useful fiction and visualizing future warfare. Is this something that you've looked at? And what opportunities do you think there are for more of this going forward, to help young people develop the sense of agency and build their forecasting and their visualization muscles?
I love that you asked about sense of agency, which I think is such a crucial facet to the useful fiction approach, and particularly even the novels, Go Sweet and Burn In, because they're, again, could be quite dystopian. And that's certainly, something I recognize, yet I never want anybody to, learn from those stories that the future is cast. Go Sweet specifically talks about all these individuals who succeed where bigger systems and bureaucracies failed. Burn In is very much about taking control over your life in an algorithmically driven world. I have, adolescent age children, and I look at their relationship with technology, how visual it is, how instantaneous it is, how also app driven and menu driven it is, how they are in a neurological level being rewired every moment of their waking day. And I have to say, I have a lot of concern about that, particularly as I go deeper into some work on, cognitive warfare and cognitive domains, in that, this is, in fact, the evolution of conflict that's coming. Certainly the kinetic aspects, the traditional tanks and planes will exist, but we're moving further into the realm of affecting human motion and behavior through software, more or less. So when you pose this question, I'm very conflicted myself, because on one level, I worry that someone is weaponizing my children someday, through these kinds of capabilities. On the other hand, I'm heartened because they're quite savvy and their imaginations are being stoked every day. We know that there is a boundless well of pretty good content out there, whether it's novels, whether it's short films, animation, et cetera, that they can draw upon to come to their own conclusions. My hope, I suppose, would be that as much as they work on studying the future, that they will also be as diligent about looking at the past, because that is, I think, one of the best ways to, contemplate what's ahead. I remember being asked on graduating from, university here in the US, what are you going to do with a history degree? And I hope my presence on this podcast is finally an answer to that question that satisfies my friend's father. But I think that's a really important thing to take away too. And I think from your perspective, the classics, you probably would double stamp that as being even more important. So I would like to hope that we are very open to people who don't often get a platform to talk about the future of conflict, but it's their future. I'll just close by saying, one of my proudest moments in the Art of Future Warfare project at the Atlantic Council was a very kind of sci-fi themed crowdsourced writing contest set in the 2090s about a conflict in space. And the best entry we had was from a writer named Alec Maden, who was a college student in California. And so we flew him to Washington, D.C., put him on stage at the Atlantic Council alongside David Brin, one of the great American science fiction writers, and other experts, technical ones and other writers, to talk about his vision of conflict. And so to me, that's a really, I think, profound expression of the role that new voices can play. And so my hope is that next week on your episode, congratulations again on the 50th, allows them to come away from that, as a voice that calls for others to join in that discussion.
Having talked to them already in advance, I know that their voices are very powerful and very transformative, and shook a lot of my assumptions right out of the window the minute I started chatting with them. A huge thumbs up there to studying history, ancient or otherwise. So I'm very glad you mentioned that. And I'm interested as well that you revert back to fiction, to some of the tools that your children and our children and other children will have growing up as a sort of counterbalance to the weaponization of social media, as novels, animation, films, and so on, the power of fiction carrying on through. Peter, are there any last comments that you want to add?
Just to thank you for having us on and congratulate you on so many episodes.
Thank you, both of you, for spending the time to talk to me. It's been really fascinating diving into what useful fiction can do as a tool in futures thinking, and also reading your work, your short stories, Ghost Fleet, Burn-In, powerful visualizations of the future in very different ways. And I heartily recommend them to our readers. They're not necessarily comfortable reads, but they are riveting reads. And, there's so much to learn from them. So thank you for taking time to talk to me. And thank you also to you, our listeners, for joining us again. Next week will be the final episode in our current series, and we'll be taking the opportunity, as I said, to kickstart a new strand of work for the Visualising War project. In our first ever episode, we interviewed Lady Lucy French, founder of Never Such Innocence, a charity which gives children and young people a voice on conflict. And since then, I've had lots of conversations with other podcast guests and listeners about the forces that shape children's habits of visualizing war and the impact which children's voices can have on how adults think about and plan for both war and peace. So we're going to be taking forward some new research on this, collaborating with Never Such Innocence, also with conflict photographer Hugh Kinsella Cunningham, and with a range of academics and authors, illustrators, museum curators, and game designers. And above all, making sure that children's views and experiences help drive our work. So it's a very fitting end to our podcast series that we're looking ahead to that. I've invited a panel of young people to join me to talk about what narratives of war and peace they've grown up with and what impact they've had on how they visualize past, present, and future conflict. So please do join me for that if you can. If you'd like to support our project, please share and subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or whatever platform you use so you don't miss an episode. And please do leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcast. It really helps people find the show. If you'd like to join the conversation further, you can follow us on social media. Just search for Visualising War, or get in touch directly by emailing us at viswar@standrews.ac.uk. Our theme music was composed by Jonathan Young. The show was mixed by Zafir Gertin. Thank you very much for listening.